Chapter 14. Mary Elizabeth Jones at Work. Mary Elizabeth Jones poured herself an oversized cup of caramel coffee and sipped it as she traipsed through the house. She first stopped by Brecker's room and hovered above her toddler as he rested ever so peacefully. What a good-looking boy. Ulysses was not a handsome man in the classical sense, and Mary Elizabeth Jones worried that Brecker would favor him. He did not look like his father, and yet, somehow, he was handsome. Mary Elizabeth Jones had named her first son Brecker, in part because it was his grandfather's maiden name, and in part because it was German. Mary Elizabeth Jones believed strongly that people lived up to their names. Appellation is fate. She despised yuppie names, preppy names, hippie names, effervescent names, and worst of all, the mock French names that black Americans had invented. LaQuisha, Latrell, Shaquille, La Princia. Did these parents hate their children? Mary Elizabeth Jones liked biblical names, but thought that they had gotten too trendy. She was skeptical of grandiose names like Julius Caesar or Queen Victoria. She liked traditional Christian names, but as is often the case with people named Jones or Smith or Johnson, she decided to give her children distinctive first names. Nothing lent gravity and distinction like a German moniker. Yes, Brecker was Mary Elizabeth Jones's mother's maiden name. Perhaps someday her parents would forgive her, and Brecker Jones would hold his grandfather's hand and bounce on his grandmother's knee. Her mother was only 1/8 German, and Mary Elizabeth Jones was only 1/16, and Brecker was less than 3% Kraut. But Brecker would possess the dignity that Nevaeh and Kip and Sunshine and Lambambia would never know. Mary Elizabeth Jones glided into the next room down the hall where her younger son, Franz Wilhelm, slept. As if he somehow sensed her presence, the infant extended his arms to his mother. Though her bond with her first son would never be duplicated, she felt drawn to little Frankie, as his father referred to him. He was such a peaceful baby. He didn't cry much. Teething was pretty low-key compared to the agony Brecker endured, and he never slept as much as most babies. He was going to have his father's energy level, and that frightened his mother. Holding Franz gently, an involuntary declaration trilled from her lips. "I can never lose my sons." This sudden utterance surprised her, and then it reminded her of that tragic event last week where a woman lost her 2 children. That memory haunted her anew. She should have been happy after seeing her lawyer. The U.S. Justice Department was willing to settle her sexual harassment suit for what would amount to 4 months' pay after the lawyers took their cut. It wasn't the pelf, and it surely wasn't anything resembling principle that should have made her smile. No, the great news was that Mary Elizabeth Jones now had job security. She would be bulletproof from here on out, at least in her job setting. She might have been satisfied, but the memory of that young mother sobbing on the wall screen just would not stop torturing her. Mary Elizabeth Jones had once more planned out her day so that she could escape the office. She had hated the anti-feng shui atmosphere the Federal Probation Office had assumed after the relocation following the first Johnson attack. Federal probation had always been a hostile environment, but it was comfortably hostile. After the Johnson operatives dispersed biological agents on, in, and around the Houston Federal Building, the probation department was moved to a cramped warehouse, and tiny cubicles were stacked together. The building initially failed health and fire inspections, and there were other unspecified delays. The union stepped in and facilitated the steady flow of salaries. Job descriptions were modified so that POs could transport themselves to meet with their parolees in the community. Mary Elizabeth Jones enjoyed this new arrangement. She would set up shop in a Starbucks or a Burger King, and her clients would meet her there to fill out requisite paperwork. She would go to work late, leave early, and chat and text most of the day. Her clients seemed to like the new system as much as she did. Unfortunately, the administrator successfully negotiated the obstacle course that allowed the rechristening of the A1 warehouse as probation's new headquarters. The camaraderie that was forged by the survival of a biological attack and the subsequent countermeasures soon morphed into acute claustrophobia. The warehouse was always too hot or too cold. There were no working fax machines or functional copiers. There were problems with the phones and problems with the wireless internet, the antiquated plumbing and the newfangled wiring. But the most noxious irritant was the noise. The old A1 warehouse was not built for quiet work. Large exhaust fans at either end of the building clattered and clanged when the weather turned warm. The building was adjacent to a trucking company, and it was not unusual for the drivers to leave their diesels running when parked outside the uninsulated walls. And the warehouse was closer to the airport than the mysterious relocation gods had calculated. The administrators agreed to install sonic cushions and acoustic camouflage, but they emphasized that all personnel would now perform their duties in their designated cubicles. No exceptions. The auditory overload would not force the administrators to budge from their firm position of authority, nor would the arrival of fancy copiers and their normal usage that caused the breaking of circuits and frequent blackouts and the prolonged stoppage of work. And they would be unyielding to the ongoing conspiracy to stuff toilets and damage pipes and induce overflow. But they would ultimately concede defeat to the lowly pigeon. Years of human vacancy at the A1 warehouse contributed to years of pigeon proliferation and thus years of accumulated bird droppings. The recent biological attacks had ushered in a new sensitivity to animal-induced hazards. A 57-year-old exterminator named John Wayne John had noticed the excess of pigeon droppings in the higher reaches of the warehouse. The remodeling helped to disperse the excrement throughout the structure. Concerned about the threat of histoplasmosis, Mr. John called a state environmental officer, and the bureaucratic equivalent of a Rube Goldberg machine was set in motion. The results were not subject to compromise. All visitors and employees would henceforth utilize eye, mouth, and nose protection while occupying the premises previously referred to as the A1 warehouse. Whatever problems that might have developed from the resulting discomfort and the generated suspicion stemming from mandatory use of goggles and surgical masks, the administrators were willing to endure. But they were not so eupeptic when the budgets were revised. No, they would not be allowed to reuse or recycle surgical masks, and yes, they would pay exorbitant biohazard disposal fees. Federal probation officers were once more encouraged to meet with their clientele in an off-site setting. Mary Elizabeth Jones had called her parolees ahead of her leaving home. Jamal Windsor was visible behind the counter at McDonald's, and she was able to collect paperwork from him without purchasing anything. She made cursory stop to collect forms from Jim Washington at Burger King, Mary Dunn at U.S. Nail, Teresa Martinez at Real Donuts, and Marty Briggs at a head of the class headstones. After waving to Mr. Briggs, Mary Elizabeth Jones visited her final stop, the home of Peter Donatello. "You are here early, my princess. You can not wait to see me," the proud host purred. Mr. Donatello was a few weeks shy of 75. He was tall and thin and moved gracefully. To Mary Elizabeth Jones's eyes, he did not look Italian, but he certainly looked European. She probably would have guessed French or German. His skin was pale, his eyes were hazel, and his mustache and full head of hair were gray. Mr. Donatello came to the U.S. as a middle-aged tailor who had done poorly in his homeland. He was in his new country a short time when a famous basketball player wandered into the big and tall store where he worked. He took the star's measurements and cut him a suit. A week later, the star suffered a one-game injury prior to the national telecast. 20 million viewers saw the basketball icon decked out in what would soon be called a Donatello. More important than the 20 million viewers were the friends and rivals of Donatello's customer. Word spread quickly, and a month later, Mr. Donatello opened an exclusive on-call tailoring service that specialized in outfitting oversized men. Mr. Donatello was an overnight success after decades of struggle. He and his wife Louise lived the Houston dream, and he sent home a lot of money to his 2 grown daughters. Then the IRS audited Mr. Donatello. Mr. Donatello served 27 months in federal prison. His 10,000 square foot home was taken by the IRS, and his savings went to his lawyers. His heroin-addicted daughter ceased writing when the checks stopped flowing, and his other daughter only sent him Muslim propaganda pamphlets. Worse yet, the 2 anchors in Mr. Donatello's life were now gone. Yao, his 8-year-old German shepherd, died at an animal shelter a few days after the house was seized. Louise died of a long bout with cancer 13 days before his release from prison. Now Mr. Donatello seemed to enjoy the company of absolutely anyone, even his parole officer. "You make it yourself at home, my princess." Mary Elizabeth Jones suspected that Mr. Donatello could have lost his Italian accent had he wanted to, but it was probably part of a larger marketing strategy. Contrived or not, the accent charmed Mary Elizabeth Jones, and she made herself comfortable in an oversized Mediterranean sofa, regally placed in front of an old-fashioned TV set in the living room. Grabbing the remote, she instinctively clicked through the news ghetto. The chemical attack was no longer the focus of the agenda makers. Or was it? The news cycle had moved to the finger-pointing stage. The Democratic gubernatorial candidate from the state of Mississippi was pointing the finger at, of all people, John Joseph. On another station, the Republican gubernatorial candidate from Mississippi was pointing his beefy finger at John Joseph. What did John Joseph have to do with the chemical attack on Waller County? If one of the world's wealthiest men had become one of Mary Elizabeth Jones's associates, she would know about it. Mary Elizabeth Jones continued to click through the news circuit. They were all laying blame. But why blame the rich kid? And why did the network suddenly care what anyone from Mississippi had to say? It was over lunch of seafood casserole and oven fresh bread that Mary Elizabeth Jones would receive her answers. Following her exile from her family, Mary Elizabeth Jones sought fatherly wisdom in the form of Peter Donatello. On any subject other than tax shelters, Mary Elizabeth Jones regarded her mentor as shrewdly insightful. Why are they blaming John Joseph? Peter Donatello studied her face and grew serious. His charming Italian accent ebbed, and his enunciation suddenly resembled the deliberate tone of Eric Sevareid. "The press turns on everybody," he stated as he dipped his warm bread in a monkey dish of olive oil. "They love the young Mr. Joseph, the youngest billionaire, the youngest deca-billionaire, the youngest centabillionaire. He brought hope to a has-been economy. Yes, we can compete with the Asians if we have a nice young man like Mr. Joseph to lead us." Conditions of his parole forbade Mr. Donatello from consuming alcohol in any form. Out of respect to his parole officer, he now drank his Pepsi out of a plastic tumbler. He savored the contents and continued. They loved him when he sent robots to the moon and made a huge profit with advertisement. They loved him when he built the world's first power sat. They loved him when he surpassed that Italian gentleman as the world's wealthiest man in the world. They even tolerated his movies and TV shows. There was a silence. A comfortable silence that made Mary Elizabeth Jones reflect that they had crossed the boundary, and she did not care. "You know, Guido," she purred affectionately, waiting for his smile before she continued, "I could take the same ingredients and combine them, and it might taste good, but it wouldn't taste like this." Peter Donatello chuckled and slid back into his labored English once more. "Same with the cloth. Suits are cut from the same cloth, but not the same tailor." Mary Elizabeth Jones smiled and sipped on her Pepsi from the plastic tumbler before continuing. "So why did the media turn on Richie the Rich Kid?" "Ah, yes," Mr. Donatello stalled as he chewed his food. "First," he said, holding his finger in the air, "he ate the forbidden apple." Mary Elizabeth Jones moved her hand in a circular gesture to say, continue. "He joined the news media. Who was this nouveau riche slob who want to join their country club? This is when we find now that Mr. Joseph exploit child labor. This is when we find now that Mr. Joseph traded stock on the inside information. This is when we find out that Mr. Joseph, he has bastard children." Mary Elizabeth Jones nodded. "Second, he eat the forbidden orange." Mary Elizabeth Jones shook her head. "First he crashed the news banquet, then he crashed the political dinner. He formed the Eclectic Party." "I thought the Eclectic Party was all a joke. It was all a publicity stunt." "No joke. He played that way. Let me have my fun. We can compete with the Democrats and the Republicans. We are a farm team." Mr. Donatello laughed. "What he farming? Rattlesnake?" Mary Elizabeth Jones was confused. She followed the news, but politics was not a subject she easily grasped. The Eclectic Party had started out running Greens against Libertarians against Constitutionalists. Fringe politics battle royale. But then they actively recruited has-beens and retreads and silver medalists from the major parties. It was all to generate news for people in the news business, wasn't it? Peter Donatello patiently explained things to her. The foundation of the Eclectic Party was a serious endeavor from its very inception. But Mr. Joseph did not show his hand right away. He built up a network of the disaffected before unleashing candidates who shared his views. In Mississippi, he was now supporting the strongest gubernatorial candidate the progressive wing of the Eclectic Party had ever produced, Eva Marie Taffy. Because Mr. Joseph's news outlets had so consistently criticized the criminal justice system, the politicians and commentators constantly blamed Mr. Joseph for generating so much undeserved animosity. He was the reason why Twisted Minds launched a chemical attack on Waller County. He was the reason. Mary Elizabeth Jones nodded and deliberately chewed on her bread. She took a sip of water and reflected on what her client had told her. She was always bombarded with news, but it did not always make sense to her. She needed someone to explain to her things to her without grinding out their own political agenda. She was once more glad she had visited Peter Donatello.